Hi everyone, Mother Jamie here with your message for the third Sunday in the Easter season, which is the story of the road to Emmaus. And that is found in Luke's Gospel, chapter 24, verses 13 through 35. And if you're a little rusty on that story, that's where Cleopas and his companion, we assume spouse, were walking back after the events of Jesus's death and rumors of the empty tomb, and they are very sad and trying to make sense of it. And this stranger comes up and says, "What are y'all talking about?" And they're like, "What? Are you living under a rock? Are you the only one who hasn't heard?" I mean, it'd be like, pandemic? What pandemic? So they fill him in, and then he begins teaching them. And then here comes the very important part of the story. They get to where Cleopas and spouse are going to be turning home, and Jesus makes as if he is going to keep walking. And they say, "Stay with us." In fact, we are told that they urged him strongly, "Stay with us, for it's getting late." And in that culture, of course, that hospitality is very important, because someone walking alone in the dark is going to be dependent on the hospitality of others. So they invite this stranger to their home, and in so doing, Jesus takes bread, blesses it, breaks it, gives it to them. Suddenly they recognize that it is Jesus. It is the risen Christ. And right at that moment of recognition, then he disappears. Now, for those of us who are raised in the church, especially in strong Eucharistic traditions, when we hear the words took, blessed, broke, gave, we instantly think of the Eucharist, communion. And so for us, this road to Emmaus story that we hear on the third Sunday of the Easter season is just a homey little reminder of the importance of communion. And so for us, if we hear this, it just reinforces our sacramental theology. And we sing, "Be known to us in the breaking of the bread." Our opening collect of the day is, "Be known to us in the breaking of the bread." And so it creates this reinforcement of our strong Eucharistic theology, which is fine, except the downside of it is that if we only hear those words in that context, then we are limited. We cheat ourselves out of the opportunity to understand the presence of Jesus in ways beyond simply the altar when we are gathered for Holy Eucharist. And it reduces this story to simply an insular feedback loop that just reinforces you have to have communion to know Jesus. You know Jesus in communion, so you need to just come and have communion more often. And it just creates that insular loop that doesn't help us when suddenly we find ourselves in a context where we can't receive the Eucharist. So like that couple walking on the road to Emmaus, kind of scratching their heads in sadness and saying, "What now?" we all find ourselves on the road to Emmaus. We all find ourselves suddenly in a position where the things we had looked to, the things we had counted on, the things that were made up our world and are not there, suddenly not there. And so we're walking along on the road, socially distanced, 6 feet apart, and wondering, well, what now? What is the future going to look like? Just like that couple, Cleopas and his companion walking down the road, It's just a big yawning chasm of unknowns. So, at this time, at this juncture, in this context in which we find ourselves, having this be a homey little story that simply reinforces the significance of the Eucharist is not what we need right now. And the story is not limited to that meaning. It's time to reach a little farther back in Luke's gospel, to the 9th chapter to be specific, the 16th verse. The day was drawing to a close. I'm actually starting at the 12th verse. And the 12 came to Jesus and said, "Send the crowd away so that they may go into the surrounding villages and countryside to lodge and get provisions. For we are here in a deserted place." But Jesus said to them, "You give them something to eat." They said, "We have no more than 5 loaves and 2 fish, unless we are to go and buy food for all these people." For there were about 5,000 men. And he said to his disciples, "Make them sit down in groups of about 50 each." They did so and made them all sit down. And taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and blessed and broke them and gave them to the disciples to set before the crowd. And all ate and were filled. What was left over was gathered up, 12 baskets of broken pieces. So, taking, blessing, breaking, and giving is also found in the feeding of the 5,000. And we should know that the story of the feeding of the 5,000 is especially important in the Gospels because it is the only miracle story about Jesus that appears in all 4 Gospels. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all have a version of the feeding of the 5,000. So that should tell us it's important. So, Jesus takes, blesses, breaks, and gives from the loaves and the fishes. Out of scarcity comes abundance. Out of his actions come nourishment for the people. Out of Jesus's blessing comes nurture for the spirit. Abundance, nourishment, nurture. But the disciples are the ones who do the legwork. Don't forget that. Jesus says, "You give them something to eat." The disciples bring it in. Jesus blesses the results. That is very significant. At this time, in this place, perhaps a more important association for us than the Eucharist, because that is a tangible and real connection with how the risen Christ meets us in the outside world. And we are all in the outside world right now. We are not in the church to hear the homey stories that keep things going, as for those of us in church world, what we consider business as usual. This is where it gets real. And so whether we find ourselves in a place of mild anxiety, profound stress, or somewhere in between, we, like Cleopas and his companion, are on this road of unknowns, scratching our heads. So as we move forward, we can take comfort in this story but we also have to be keenly aware of the role each of us plays in this story. Because with stress, with anxiety, with fear, with unknowns come a lot of unpleasant emotions that we're probably all feeling. Anger, resentment, just that kind of lashing out as a way of trying to maintain control wherever we can. All of those ways that we have of coping. Some of them good and healthy, some of them are destructive and unhealthy. But all of those are human responses to stress. So remember and be inspired by Cleopas and Cleopas's companion. Because in the midst of their grief, in the midst of their sadness, here comes this dude who's like acting like he's has never heard of what's going on. Had they reacted in anger or fear, hostility, resentment, had they have told the guy off, like, what is wrong with you? Get away from us. Had they done that, then they would never have known that they were with the risen Christ. Remember, Jesus was going to walk on by. He didn't invite himself. They had to invite him into their home. Jesus wasn't going to come uninvited, and they didn't know it was him. So they had to open their home, open their hearts to this stranger. So had they been stuck in anger, had they been stuck in fear, or had they been so preoccupied with their own stuff that they had neglected their manners of hospitality, they would not have known. They would have missed the opportunity. It was only by inviting Jesus into their home that they then knew who he was and received the blessings of his presence. And so, again, that is that hard spiritual work of maintaining an open heart, maintaining an openness to recognizing the risen Christ in our midst, even in the midst of those stressful, difficult emotions that tempt us to shut down and focus only on ourselves. And also, remember, it was only really in hindsight. They were like, oh, weren't our hearts strangely warmed when we were walking on the road? Yeah, I had that feeling too. Well, that's how it is for most of us. We do what we have to do to get through the day, and then we look back and go, oh, wow, I really received grace and blessing in this way and that way. That's how it works. So, road to Emmaus, it's the Easter season, biggest feasting season of the whole church year. It is good news. It is great news that Jesus, the risen Christ, walks among us. We may not recognize him, and we may think, this is crazy, pandemic? What pandemic? But by inviting him in, we allow him to take, bless, break, and give abundance out of scarcity, nourishment for the journey, and nurture for our spirits. Stay safe, stay sane, and stay connected in the bonds of love. Bye-bye now.